Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Mesa-Lands Community College's presentation on Constitution Day. We're commemorating Constitution Day. Constitution Day was actually on September 17th, but here we are at a time when we can all get together and talk about some of the good stuff to do with the Constitution. My name is Dr. Stephen Edwards. I'm the professor of history at Mesa-Lands Community College and the head of discipline of history at Mesa-Lands Community College. We have here also Professor Nick Bush, who is a professor of political science and also the discipline head of political science as well. We're going to give you some brief presentations on some constitutional related topics, which we anticipate that you'll find interesting and instructive, and then we'll have additional information after we've both gone. So, Professor Bush, fire away.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. As he mentioned, I am the professor of political science here at Mesa-Lands Community College, as well as the discipline lead for the Department of Political Science. My presentation today will mostly focus on the lead up to the Constitution, the writing and signing of the Constitution in the United States. And when I get to the Constitution, I'll mention a few things about that before handing it off to Dr. Edwards to talk more about the convention itself. So we can start here with talking about the Declaration of Independence. As most of you are familiar, the Declaration of Independence was the document that was basically the one that split us away from the English monarchy, right? So the document itself lists a number of grievances. Basically, it's like, we're mad and this is why, right? So, and then it lists X, Y, Z, ABC, whatever, why we are angry. Essentially, though, all those grievances can be grouped into this concept of, they felt that natural law, the law that they believed has been bestowed upon us by some supernatural God creator being, which was above any other kind of law, should be the one that really guides our laws for our governments. And they felt that the laws in England had drifted too far from that natural law. So we see this a lot throughout the document, but some of the most notable quotes are some of the ones that really became the most famous. Toward the beginning, it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident, again, meaning that this must have come from somewhere beyond man, that these things are proof of themselves. That all men are created equal. So they're talking about how we were created. Again, not referring to laws by man, but laws from somewhere up above. That they were created and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights that could not be taken away by anybody. And that these rights included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So as we read through this, we see that they were really concerned that England had kind of gone astray with regard to what they felt the natural law would have liked for the way government was being run. Another interesting part of the Declaration of Independence is that it refers to the United States plurally. Frequently throughout the document, it refers to these United States, or it will use the word united with lowercase u. So what they're saying is that it's a bunch of people that are kind of hanging out together, but they're not really one necessarily. It's a whole bunch of states that are kind of united, but they're also kind of a bunch of different people. And it refers to the good people of these united colonies. And this is going to be really important when we get to the Constitution later, because you'll see a big difference in the way that they understand and view the nature of the United States as being united. So after the Declaration of Independence, we had to form a new government. We were no longer part of England, at least as far as we were concerned. The English might have had something else to say about that, but we needed to form a new government, but we were scared to death of having a government that was too powerful. That was really the big thing, right? In England, we felt that the king had too much power. So we set up something called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation was basically designed to create a wartime confederation of these states so that we could work together in fending off the British or any other foreign threat that we may face. But ultimately, within a decade, this proved to be a failure. And a lot of the reason for this has to do with the fact that the government that was set up then was too weak. They gave too much power to the states, not enough power to a central government. And so this culminated with there was a rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays Rebellion. Essentially, what happened was we had accumulated and accrued all this debt during the Revolutionary War that we couldn't pay down. Part of the reason we couldn't pay it down was because the Articles of Confederation did not give the central government the power to levy taxes. Because we couldn't raise taxes, we couldn't pay down debt. So some of the states started to try to do this. Unfortunately, in some states like Massachusetts, these debts or these taxes disproportionately affected the lower class, the farmers, people like that, as opposed to the business owners. Some of these farmers obviously got angry about this. There was a rebellion, and there was nobody to put it down. It's like when you call the fire department, there's no fire department. And again, this is because the government did not have the power to raise an army, didn't have power to raise taxes to pay for an army. And so this went on and on until finally a militia that was privately funded by the business owners was able to put it down. This really kind of set into motion this conversation about the fear of what if this had been a bigger threat? What if this was more than just farmers with pitchforks, right? What if this had been the British? What if this had been the French? What if this had been the Germans? There were much more powerful threats out there, and we couldn't put down the small one, right? And so this conversation began that maybe we should talk about changing these Articles of Confederation. Maybe we erred too much in favor of a weak central government because of our experiences with the British, but maybe we were wrong, right? So then we get to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, where all these people come together and they decide we're going to write a new government. And so basically they had two main goals here. One was to correct these issues with the articles, right? They had to write something giving the government more power, the central government. But they also really, going back to the Declaration, needed to find a way to bring this positive law, this written law by man, into more alignment with this natural law from God, right? And unfortunately, doing both of these things at the same time didn't always mean making the same choices and decisions. There were lots of promises that were made in the Declaration of Independence, most notably the promises of equality and liberty. You might recall when I said that they said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we have these unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They promised us equality and liberty, right? But what they didn't say at the time was that these two rights are competing. There's a paradox, that any increase in liberty decreases equality, and vice versa. If you increase equality, the liberty will decrease. And what they never did was give us a magic ratio or a magic number of how to balance how much liberty do we give at the expense of equality, or vice versa. And for 235 years now, we have continuously sought to try to figure out how to rectify this, how to keep this promise made by the Declaration. Another document that I'm not going to get into today, but one that I would point you toward, is the Gettysburg Address. Many people think that this was just the dedication of a cemetery during the Civil War. But really, if you look at this, the very beginning when he says, fourscore, blah, 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 like we promised you these things, but we didn't deliver. Our founding fathers said, you can have liberty, you can have equality, that all men are created equal, but we didn't give that to you. And now we're fighting this war, and all these people here are dead because we could not carry out this promise. And we are at a crossroads now in history, where if we fail, not only does America fail, but the rest of the world that is watching our democracy, they will abandon their attempts at democracy if we fail. And we have to find out right now how we can make this promise work out. How can we give people equality and liberty? Because when we wrote the Constitution, we didn't give you that. The Constitution, as I said, did not carry out the promises of equality, most notably, and part of it called the Three-Fifths Compromise. You may have learned about it before, but essentially what happened was when they were trying to decide how many representatives to allocate to different states, the South, they're going to count the population. They said, well, we'll do by population. The states with larger populations will get more representatives, right? Well, the South says, well, we want to count the slaves toward our population because that will give them more representatives, right? The North, of course, is like, no, that's not fair. We don't want the South to have disproportionately more power, right? So we were at a crossroads again. And we were actually looking at the potential of this whole thing failing, that the Constitution would not be signed, it wouldn't be ratified, that the whole government would fail. And remember, this is after the Articles of Confederation. We were scared to death of any uprising. We needed something right now to take care of us, some kind of protection. Meanwhile, remember that we still have British people, the British, sailing right off the shores, off the East Coast. We needed some way to protect ourselves. And so, unfortunately, our founding fathers were forced to make a decision. Do we allow slavery to continue, and do we concede to the southern states the ability to count their slaves toward the population, giving them disproportionate power in the legislative branch? Or do we go ahead and ban slavery and not get the support of the southern states? The Constitution isn't ratified, and we walk away with nothing. And we're left with nothing but this Articles of Confederation we've already seen fail. And so they had no choice at this point but to say, we'll allow slavery to last a little longer. But a little longer ended up 100 years. It was 100 years before we ever really came back around to deal with this issue again. 100 years longer meant how many more slaves? And so that is one of the more glaring examples in the Constitution where they failed at the promise of equality, but had no real choice otherwise. There are other examples. Women, for example, were not considered equal. It wasn't until 1920 that women got the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. There were instances around the country where white men who did not own property were also not allowed to vote. So the equality that was promised in the Declaration certainly was not delivered, at least not in its entirety in the Constitution. And that is what has defined the 235-year adventure, the American adventure, since then. It has been a continuous effort and a continuous search for ways the perfect way to give American people equality and liberty at the same time. So you gotta have your cake and eat it too, right? And we have yet to find that perfect ratio, that perfect balance. But I think that it's fair to say that 235 years later, we are far closer to finding that than we were in 1787, 235 years ago, or 1789, when the amendments were first ratified, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. I think that every year we go, every conflict that we have domestically or internationally in the United States brings us closer. We are forced to look at ourselves with more introspection and to find ways to reconcile these two competing concepts of liberty and equality. I think here would be a good spot to talk more about the convention, if that's you. At this point, I'll go ahead and reintroduce Dr. Stephen Edwards, who is the professor of history here at Mesa Lands Community College, as well as the discipline lead for the Department of History. And I think he's going to talk more about the convention itself, which is kind of where I left off. So.
Thanks, Nick, very much. And I'm going to touch on some of those key points that were very, very appropriate to bring up when we talk about Constitution Day, because it's an incomplete living document, isn't it? And they knew that when the delegates arrived at the Philadelphia Convention. They didn't call it the Constitutional Convention; they called it the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. There was one member who arrived sort of later than a lot of other guys did. He was already 81, a little overweight, right? They brought him in on a sedan chair carried by 4 prisoners from the Philadelphia Penitentiary, and sort of like thinking the doors open and they bring this guy who maybe looks like a king in on a chair, right? There are 4 dudes carrying him. They set him down, and that's Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who had already earned something of a reputation. And my students know that I have something of an unhealthy relationship with Dr. Franklin. It's a one-way relationship. He won't return my calls, but he's still one of the most interesting figures, I think, to study because of the influence that he has on this process and on this convention. Because Franklin has some ideas, and he has some influence, and he has some cachet. And even though it might be easy to overstate his influence at the convention, he doesn't do everything, right? There are a lot of other players that do other things throughout the convention. So I don't mean to overstate any of his contributions, but there are a few who were as looked up to or as respected or as listened to at the time of the convention as Benjamin Franklin. And his influence began even before the convention did. He was probably the most, other than perhaps George Washington, nationally and internationally, the most famous American, not just because of his political achievements, but because of his scientific pursuits and intellectual achievements as well. Franklin helped pioneer, at least in America, the idea that freedom of religion, that freedom of the press, and freedom of the speech are sacred rights, something that you just can't mess with, something that you can't just take away. These are all deeply ingrained within his background. He was born in a religious town, Boston, but did not belong to an organized religion himself. He was a printer by trade, and his older brother had gotten thrown into jail in 1721 for bad-mouthing the local clergy. And so he had, the freedom of the press is very near and dear to Franklin's heart, as is the freedom of religion. When he formed a club called the Junto in North America, he would have the members, the prospective members of the Junto, put their hand on their heart and swear that they loved truth for truth's sake and would not discriminate against any member of any religion, whether inward or outward whatsoever. And that's not just a thing that was nice to have or nice to say or nice to hear. That's essential to the survival of someone like Franklin, and he helps carry those same fundamental American truths and ideal over into the Constitution. It's not just that it would be more convenient to have a freedom of the press or freedom of religion in America. In order for America to work together, in order for all the states to be compatible, they have to tolerate each other. And that comes with a tolerance of religion. And Franklin knew that, and that was one of the first influences that he put upon this new government. And I want to say it was 1784, but don't do anything bad to me if I'm wrong, that Pennsylvania ratified its state constitution. And in there, they had a clause requiring members of its assembly to declare what their religious practices were. And Franklin vehemently opposed this, as you might imagine, and we don't see a carryover of that clause from the Pennsylvania state constitution into the national constitution, in part because of Franklin's influence. Franklin also influenced the president of the convention. There are two Americans with the cachet, with the experience, with the political chops to lead the convention: George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin doesn't want to do that. He's 81. He doesn't like to, we can sympathize with him here, right? He doesn't like to crack the sheets before 11 o'clock in the morning. He likes to take his time and have a leisurely breakfast. He doesn't want to lead the convention, but he wants unity, right? And so he gets up, the first thing he does is he nominates George Washington to be the president of the convention. This does a couple of things. Number one, it nominates George Washington to be the president of the convention, but it also eliminates him as a candidate so that he doesn't have to do it. And as it turns out, George Washington leads the convention very adroitly and very, very capably, and is able to meander and steer the delegates with all their different wishes and inclinations and determinations through all of those compromises. Franklin had a number of proposals for the Constitution that were not included, but that did influence the eventual outcome. Again, it's easy to overstate his influence, right? We can talk about, there would be a Constitution without Franklin, but it might have been framed a little bit differently. For example, Franklin suggested that the president not make a salary, that he not be paid, he'd be an unpaid federal employee. And in a letter to this is a speech. This is a speech about the subject of salaries. He says, there are two passions which have a powerful influence in the affairs of men: the love of power and the love of money. Separately, each of these has a great force in prompting men to action. But when united in view of the same object, they have in many minds the most violent effects. Not bad reasons, really, right? You don't want to combine supreme power in one person and then have them want to do that for the money. What a terrible combination. He was worried that, and again quoting from Franklin, that quote, fruitless and mischievous wars, unquote, might result if the president had the ability to pursue conflict for material gain. And perhaps, as it turns out, maybe throughout the course of the presidency, something like that might have gone down. In order to prevent one person from having too much power, Franklin suggested that there be not one, not two, but 3 chief executives, a panel of presidents to govern. You want to do that, right? You want to do the presidential election thing every 2 years instead of, no, that sounds awful, right? And elect not 1, but 3. But again, his reasoning is pretty solid. If you have 3 presidents, then one can't turn into a despot, right? Then one can't exert too much unfair power and influence over the country. Franklin also did not want the president to have an absolute veto, right? Just that's it. Just axe whatever law that Congress passed and have it be done. This inspired the veto override, right? So a bill gets passed, goes to the president. If the president vetoes it, whether actively or inactively, Congress can override that veto. So yes, there's still a veto. If there's a dangerous or unconstitutional law that the president wants to strike down, they have the power to do that. But then Congress can override that veto if they feel that it's a necessary piece of legislation. So no, we don't have 3 presidents. Yes, the president does get paid. The president doesn't get paid that much. And there are specific checks and balances on presidential power as a result of a lot of people's, but also Franklin's fear that an executive might turn corrupt. I mentioned compromise earlier. There was, and Professor Bush mentioned how many representatives. There was a big fight during the convention about who would get, how many representatives does the state have? And is it by population? Does each state get the same number? Franklin was a key aspect in getting this compromise worked out that settled this question. Somebody in the mail sent Franklin a jar containing a dead snake. Like, so what? It's a dead snake. The dead snake had 2 heads. He said, of a jar of formaldehyde snake, 2 heads. Whoa, that's a pretty cool snake. And with the snake was a letter accompanied that said, this snake died because it crawled under a bush and ran into the stem of the bush and couldn't free itself. Each of the heads wanted to go a separate direction. Now, Franklin understood that right away. You and I might need a little bit of help, right? If you don't reconcile, if you don't compromise on some stuff, like, I don't know, the number of representatives or whether those representatives are apportioned by population as opposed to by equally by state, then the whole thing might fall apart, right? And so Franklin gets up and tells this story about the snake who's stuck on the bush and says, we need to work this out, right? We need to go one way or the other, or we're going to starve to death fighting ourselves on this rotten bush. And so they worked out a compromise where there's going to be 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in one, you've got representation apportioned by population. And in the other, every state has an equal say, regardless of how large or small they may be. And so finally, everything gets wrapped up. There are a lot of imperfections, as we've already noted, within the Constitution. There are a lot of things that perhaps maybe were there as a compromise, perhaps maybe were there just because, perhaps maybe were there because they didn't know any better. But at the conclusion of the convention, Franklin got up and gave a speech. And in that speech, one of the most famous passages from that speech addresses his approval of the Constitution. He says, for when you assemble a number of men for when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interest, and their selfish views. Again, the Constitution was not necessarily perfect. That doesn't mean that he wasn't in support of it. he continues, from such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies. And as it turns out, it has. The American Constitution was the first codified or written down constitution, and since that time, every other nation in the world, except for three, in case you're curious, it's Britain, New Zealand, and Israel, have written down constitutions following the example of the United States Constitution. And is it perfect? No. Is it what we needed? Is it what we could do to keep the country together and get the country rolling? Absolutely. Has it stood the test of time? Also, yes, without a doubt. As the convention was concluding, and as delegates were leaving to go home, supposedly, as the story goes, right, a lady stops Franklin as he's leaving the convention hall, and she says, "Sir, what have you wrought? Have you wrought a republic or a monarchy? What have you wrought? What have you done? What have you guys created? Right? What has been the result of this convention?" And as the story goes, right, this lady says, "What have you done?" And Franklin looks at her and he says, "Well, we've created a republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that was his challenge to her, and that's his challenge to all of us. It's only a republic as long as we, the keepers of the republic, ensure that it remains so. And that's Franklin's challenge to us, and I also extend that challenge to you, that let's continue not just learning about and respecting the Constitution, but also furthering its precepts and continuing to foster and love this republic that they crafted for us. Thanks very much.